Hi, my name is Dr. Dyann Ross. I'm the love theorist in the podcast that I create, and this may be a podcast you're listening to or a video. I'm also a social work educator, and that's the main capacity I'm speaking to you in today. One of my absolute privileges in life is to share a classroom with, teach, and hopefully help students, social work students, to learn about how to be social workers in what is an incredibly complex world. So there's nothing straightforward about being a social work student or a social work academic, as you could imagine. And the ideas and values and practice strategies we share with students can one day change someone's life, maybe even save someone's life, maybe contribute in a really meaningful way to a community or workplace. All sorts of ways that social workers contribute can come from little gems of wisdom or insights or an idea they gain in their undergraduate qualifying degree. So one of the ideas that I have been asking my students to think about lately has caused some initial consternation and cause to have to really dig deep in how I talk with students about the issue of broken-heartedness. Now, I've talked about this issue in a fairly recent podcast or video, but for now, I just want to introduce it again very briefly, because actually the main purpose of today's video is to talk about once you have an understanding of broken-heartedness, what can you do about it? And this is, of course, a key priority for social workers, to not only have good ideas and great principles, but to know how to act and be with people in complex and often really challenging situations. So this is part 2, really, of broken-heartedness and social work. And the emphasis is on a key approach, which is still probably fairly broad in what I'll be saying, which I'm going to summarize as love practices. Love practices and strategies to address broken-heartedness. Now, as you see, we immediately come to another really big concept, and one that also causes students to at least scratch their heads. Some react quite strongly to the idea that love belongs in social work. And I won't speak too much about that level of that concept today, except to say that I see love as integral to good social work practice, to good practice of any kind where we're involved with people. And I'm not talking about sentimental feelings of love that happen in intimate relationships or family settings, although obviously those all have their place. I'm talking about love as a social and political capacity to act for the highest good for people in a situation with them, where no harm is done and where justice and well-being are achieved. Now, as you see, I've gone to a really big idea of what love is, and it is also a very contested idea. But I draw my inspiration from people like Bell Hooks, who says in a very profound statement, I believe, in her writings and advocacy, that where there is love, there is no oppression. And she says that if all public policy was created with love for the minority status groups in mind, there would be no oppression, there would be no violence in our society. Clearly, we're a long way from that. So in a nutshell, what I'm wanting to do with you today is share how I understand broken-heartedness to be a symptom of issues of violence and injustice in our society, which are possible due to a lack of love. The idea of lovelessness is central to broken-heartedness. And one of the really crucial things that happen when someone doesn't feel loved is that they start to feel a loss of dignity, a loss of self-respect, possibly even a loss of safety, and a loss of other people's goodwill and good regard toward them. And within that sense of being unloved, or where people are withholding love, that there is an injustice and harm occurring. This is my particular interest in broken-heartedness and social work. So today, this concept of love, which I've just briefly introduced, because under the umbrella of love practices, there are so many ways to contribute to what is happening for a person, even in our personal lives, not only in professional practice. So if we understand love as any actions that bring good to a situation, hopefully serve to address issues of violence and lovelessness and injustice, then it's a wide field. It is a very wide field. And sometimes it's about choosing the right tools and the right strategies that resonate with love to fit the situation and with the people you're working with. So it's a bit like a puzzle, but it's a really important puzzle, because one of the most important points in understanding broken-heartedness and using love approaches to broken-heartedness is to not blame the person for what is happening to them, not blame the person for being subjected to domestic violence, not blaming the person for having an extreme form of mental illness that causes them to become aggressive, and if not aggressive, then self-harming, not blaming the parents who haven't cared for their children and have had their children taken from them by state authorities. At the same time, just as a brief comment in passing, but not insignificant, it's not about absolving people for their individual responsibility in situations where they find themselves. But and alongside that, a large part of my understanding of broken-heartedness is the idea that social, economic, and political factors, social issues, are usually far beyond the individual's ability to directly influence. So think of housing costs and the impact on people who are renting. The ability to afford rent is only partly, if only a small part, related to the person and whether they're working or not, and if they're working, what their income is. So many factors contribute to unaffordable housing. As we know, it's a major issue in Australia and across the world at this time. So where the responsibility sits is part of what love practices attempt to do. It's that they start any intention of an approach that is encompassing of the highest good in a situation has to ask the question: what are the broader issues? Who is responsible? And what is my part as a social worker in this instance? And what is the part of the people I'm working with? What are our responsibilities in this situation? And so these are big questions, and you may find that you don't even know what you're meant to do, and your job description might really limit what you can do as a social worker, so that's already can be a challenge. It may also be that the people you're working with don't know what to do or don't agree with what you think they should do. So in terms of us in direct relationships taking our proper responsibilities, there is nothing straightforward about that. Just to say, though, it is absolutely incumbent on social workers to do everything they can to avoid acting in ways that add to the problem, to act with no coercion, no harming, no threats, no violence. And in having said that, there is a lot in it. And it's often the case that where social workers have a statutory responsibility under legislation of some kind, like child protection legislation or mental health legislation, that it may become our responsibility to act in a highly coercive way to control or intervene and act in some way that is perceived to be against the people who we are trying to help. So just what love is in that situation is very complicated and may not be perceived, your actions may not be perceived as loving, in fact. Now, just coming back off that complexity, because that deserves its own space, that kind of discussion. So the idea of doing no harm is often articulated in professional codes of ethics, non-malevolence, and acting with beneficence. These are the kinds of concepts that I'm talking about. So here we put love practices right beside being non-violent, being non-coercive, acting, as some legislation says, in least restrictive ways for people's own self-determination and ability to act for themselves. And at times that least restrictive, least coercive way is still a matter of using force against somebody. So again, coming back off that complicated line of discussion, we're talking about the broad approach of love practices for addressing broken-heartedness. And we're saying that you both need to know how to be with and present for the people you're working with, to not add to the problem, to be absolutely mindful and working hard, to be non-coercive and non-forceful, to be encouraging appropriate responsibility for people in their own actions and in situations that they have control over. And at the same time, and not ever to let this part of the responsibility to be loving go, to paint the picture of who are the other responsible people, organisations, businesses, who, and what are they doing, and are they actively causing the issue, and if so, are they aware of the impact, and if so, are they doing anything about it, and if not, what are you going to do about that? And if you're not going to do something about it, who is going to do something? And that's a fair enough question. There may be other groups, other civil society groups acting to uphold fair treatment of people. Okay, so this is about the social nature of social work and how in the individual circumstances that where we meet people, the social and political and economic factors are reflected and mirrored and sometimes often resisted in the person's own life. So this, to not hold that bigger picture, risks blaming people, seeing them as having to do all the acting, for example, where there's a difficulty paying the rent because of the extreme cost of rent, blaming the person, helping them with budgeting as your only action so that they can better cope with not having enough money to pay their rent. Clearly, you would need to do that, perhaps depending on your role. And you'd want to be making sure people have food on the table, and you'd all sorts of direct practice support at that survival and ability to cope level. And at the same time, we need to be raising our voice with others around the issues so that they get addressed and that people don't continue to struggle in situations not of their own choosing and then being blamed for it. Okay, so what we're talking about here is a whole range of approaches, but at the beginning, it has to be an ethical stance of love practices for addressing broken-heartedness. And when I say it has to be an ethical stance, what I'm talking about is you have to really believe that love in its broad and deep understanding of it that I'm talking about. Somewhere in how we think about it and work with that idea in the particularities of a situation, there will be ways forward. Then if there isn't an obvious way forward or a way that a step can be taken with the person, as I was saying in the previous broadcast message about this called Broken-heartedness and social work, being present with a person, affirming and acknowledging their experiences and deeply listening to their stories is the least we can do. We can always do that, and that is a practice of love in itself. Okay, so this ethic of love, as Bell Hooks calls it, is being able to look deeply into situations, understanding complexity and knowing how to translate with people, how to get your bearings and know how to act in that situation. So today, what I want to do is just say a little bit more about the nature of love in terms of how it is a type of power for good that in whichever way we interpret it and use it, is the counterbalance, is the answer to issues of violence, lovelessness, and injustice that cohere in different ways for people and cause broken-heartedness. So love as a force for good, as a type of power, is maybe not an obvious way of thinking about it, but all our education, social work education and other helping professions, teaches love practices, teaches interpersonal skills for engaging people with respect and regard and showing empathy as one and as several examples of nonviolent communication skills. Social work also teaches about group work, working in organisations, working with communities, and as another example, community development skills are all nonviolent skills. And so social workers are really well placed to gather up and think of all their skills as love practices. And in so doing, gain some extra, I'd say, confidence and a sense of ability to make a difference um, with these complex manifestations of broken-heartedness. So what I just want to catch now are some examples of how the power of love needs to match and change, but if not change, resist a harmful situation. So there are many examples I could use, and one is a complex one, but I'll try and speak to just aspects of it. For a period of time, in fact, for many years, I worked alongside some members of a community in Western Australia who were experiencing all sorts of impacts from a multinational mining company, from what they perceived as pollution from an alumina refinery, pollution in terms of airborne pollution that caused nosebleeds, asthma, multiple chemical sensitivity, and other health impacts. And there were environmental and other impacts as well. This is from the community's point of view. The mining company invited us as researchers to come in and see if we could help resolve the issue. And it's complex and a big story, and there's been a fair bit written about it that you might like to check out. What I want to talk about just briefly as part of this presentation with you today is that we had to work on a few levels. We had to work at the individual level with community members and how they were experiencing the situation. We had to work with the mining company, the Alcoa World Alumina at Wagerup, and show regard and respect for their perspective. And we also work with the government to see what their proper responsibility was in protecting the people and the community while this very large mining operation kept going. So, and was within all the appropriate environmental and other guidelines. So you can see there are 3 layers of groups of people that we needed to work with. And it's very complicated to do justice to all groups because everybody actually has a different perspective, different impacts, different needs, and different responsibilities. Now, coming back off that example, what I can say in terms of outcomes, and this is a fairly hard one to put tangibles on, is that the mining company is now one of the most regulated multinational mining companies in Australia. Now, that's not directly only or even about what we did as social workers. It was very much about supporting the local activist groups to raise the issues, to gather the evidence, which they've been doing more than 20 years now, to show the kinds of impacts and to build bridges with the government in particular and their appropriate authorities, their health department, their environmental department, for what their proper actions need to be. So building a dialogue with the government and, where possible, a dialogue with the mining company. So big example of the people who we work with and how the people we supported through their activism, it mattered. It mattered that we did that. We affirmed, supported, helped build the knowledge base and acknowledged the importance of lived experience and supported strategies that were non-violent and sought dialogue rather than conflict. Nevertheless, most of the work involved in addressing broken-heartedness involves, sooner or later, if not yourself, then you might find yourself supporting someone, speaking up to people in powerful positions about what the problem is, and preferably you're doing that alongside the people and groups and communities who are being impacted. Now, that might not always go so well. I see plenty of examples in the media of activists and concerned communities raising issues, doing so over many years, not necessarily being heard, but sometimes being heard and sometimes progress being made. So these are about social campaigns, social justice activities, and this is where social work is often part of the group of people, not necessarily waving a flag declaring that we're social workers. So what's important among many things in working with brokenheartedness is that willingness to be with the people who are impacted and experiencing brokenheartedness, injustice in all its different forms, and knowing how to engage the powerful in dialogue to address the justice issues. Otherwise, the issues don't go away and people continue to be treated unfairly and hurt and brokenhearted. And so I believe so many of our health issues, especially mental health issues, but not only mental health issues, are related to brokenheartedness due to unfairness and lack of love in our society. So, there are many ways we will come to this as social workers, many ways we can act, but to approach brokenheartedness with any aspect of love means that you have to really skill up and make sure your actions are loving and that you're not treating the powerful people as the enemy, as bad people, but that you show proper respect as you engage them, that you really build up on your conflict resolution skills, knowing that sometimes some conflicts are not fully resolved, some injustice are not fully achievable of compensation and recovery from harm done, but some steps can be made if the processes, strategies, and steps you're taking with people are non-violent and are loving to all parties. But that is not a straightforward thing to do, and it won't happen overnight, and it will take a lot of people, and it won't always be you in the middle of those actions, as I said. So what I think is important is to recognize that a lot of the time that the people we're working with who we see as experiencing brokenheartedness will need to develop skills in, I'm not saying in any level accepting the situation, but in resisting blaming themselves and in resisting the harm that's coming from the situation, while hopefully some of us are trying to address the deeper causes of that issue. So I just want very quickly to talk about that concept of resistance. This is about recognizing the complexity of factors, the complexity of who's responsible for what in a social issue that's impacting the people you're engaged with. And in all of that, acting in ways to protect people from further harm, to understand the harm, and to have ways of managing and resisting the harm. And the idea of critical thinking, looking deeply in society, understanding what's happening is part of that practicing resistance. And to make that a little bit more tangible, most of the people social workers work with are experiencing some form of stigma. So for people I've worked with in the mental health area, the stigma of mental illness, while it's lessening in some ways for some types of mental illness, it is still a big issue in our society. Now, stigma is a negative valuation of a person that they come to be aware of through comments and media and all sorts of ways, that there's something wrong with them because they have a mental illness. It causes very deep-seated harm and hurt and is the root cause, I believe, of brokenheartedness for people who are experiencing mental illness. So what I want to say is, wherever you're working, whoever you're working with, if you see the deep agony and pain that happens with brokenheartedness, if people are being treated unfairly, have a deep think with the people. Do they feel devalued? Do they feel dehumanized and judged in a negative way? Listen to what the people are saying, and there's a good chance that they're experiencing stigma. Now, stigma is sometimes more painful and hard to live with and survive than the actual other challenges a person might be going through. Stigma is a form of discrimination. Discrimination against people is illegal, and yet it is embedded through Australian society as a way of often controlling, inadvertently, sometimes on purpose, people who are not desirable in some ways, according to some people. So it's a really useful way of thinking of how do I get hold of what is the nature of the brokenheartedness happening here, and how do I help people not just cope, but understand and hold their own dignity and some form of resistance while we work out the bigger interlinking influences and factors that are adversely impacting them. So I really strongly suggest you keep that idea of stigma in mind alongside this notion that any form of love practice with people across all the players involved in a situation is important. It may be about holding ground, not gaining ground. It may be about building relationships with powerful people before you can have the big hard conversations and so on. So one of the things, just in closing, because this has been a fairly big topic, hasn't it? The example I was using of the community in Western Australia, at one point we did have a really amazing opportunity where all the key people, the community people who were being impacted as they saw it by pollution and subsequent selling, Alcoa buying of properties and the collapsing of the town and its infrastructure, as many people bought up in fear of what was happening. What we managed to do for more than 12 months was hold a series of actually public meetings with concerned citizens, often people who worked at Alcoa representatives, the government, sometimes lawyers, sometimes town planners, various significant expert groups, and held a dialogue about what the issues were in the town and who needed to do what. And there were many indirect and immediate benefits from that dialogue according to the problem solving that was happening between all the layers and people involved. There was a parliamentary inquiry called because of it. There were requirements on Alcoa to buy properties where the people felt they were being impacted further afield, even if Alcoa didn't agree they were being impacted. And so, as those public meetings and dialogues were happening, it was making a difference. And so I really do believe in dialogue across all the power differences, and dialogue is a very sophisticated form of love practice where people are treated as equals at the dialogue table and are equally heard and valued, and together find ways forward. So this has been a conversation with you about how placing love and an ethic of love in the center of your thinking about what we can do if we believe brokenheartedness is occurring brings us to an incredibly broad range of non-violent actions, loving, gentle ways of being with people. And the belief underpinning all of this is that the power of love is more enduring, more empowering to engage people around than violence. So I think there are many examples of this across the planet, of the power of love, and bringing that into social work to start to address issues of brokenheartedness in a more conscious, purposeful way, I think will be really useful. And I certainly recommend it and am actively trying to practice in that way myself. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope you found that of value to you and hope to see you again soon. Bye.